All right, folks, welcome to Investing for Beginners podcast. Today, my friend Brett and I from Chitchat Stocks are going to talk about switching costs. Last time we talked about network effects. This time we're going to talk about switching costs as a moat. So, Brett, welcome back to the show again, and let's talk some switching costs.
Yeah, glad to be back. Talk to network effects. Today we're talking switching costs, and I'm sure we're going to eventually cover the other two of the big four competitive advantage categories or moats, which also include as a teaser, and people can go research some of this stuff themselves. Economies of scale and brand slash intangible assets such as patents. Kind of relevant today
Yeah.
as we're in the midst of popular stock Hims and Hers and Novo Nordisk getting into quite the battle
Yes.
over intellectual property, patents, and all that good stuff. But yeah, let's talk switching costs, otherwise known as the power of inertia in
Mm-hmm.
everyone's daily life and business life. And this is one of my favorite moats, my favorite competitive advantages, because it has turned into some really good stocks over the years. You
Mm-hmm.
got Microsoft, you have banks, although some of them haven't done that well lately, but durable franchises over the long term. Tons of other software providers,
Mm-hmm.
telecom. There's a lot of ways that switching costs can turn into a great business, even though some of these same companies might be the ones that listeners, individuals, customers can get frustrated with in their everyday lives, but can maybe something that doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive, but if it's so frustrating in your everyday life to use, but you can't leave, well, that might mean they got a little bit of monopoly going there. And, you know, that can lead to pricing power and good profits.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So if you had to define switching costs, I think you kind of outlined it a little bit there, but if you had to define it, what would you say it is?
So the switching cost is if we're going to switch, let's say we have an existing product or service we use or that you buy or what have you. You have an existing relationship and it's going to cost you some sort of value in either time, money, or frustration to get an equivalent product. And the larger that is, the more time needs to be spent, the more employee frustration, the more employee hours, and the more money that needs to be spent to switch from this existing service to rip and replace and fill in another product in its stead. That is the wider competitive advantage. I think that about sums it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely would say that. So you mentioned the whole. It's not just financial, but time. Like what does that really mean?
I think it means if you're an individual, so there's a difference between business to consumer. So, say, as a listener in their everyday life, their personal spending habits, there's a difference between that and then B2B. Maybe we can go through both examples. It is really just how much time and frustration it takes to switch, or how much of data is built on this one platform. For example, one that comes to mind for myself is a music streaming service such as Spotify. When you look at the start of using a music streaming service, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, what have you, they all have the same amount of music. They all work with the labels, they all work with the independent distributors. The existing catalog is the same. But as you build out your playlist, as you build out the relationship with the platform, as they build their discovery playlist, especially with Spotify and all the different things that add on with that, that can create a high switching cost in moving. Now, there might be some service that can port it over for you, but if it takes hours to replicate the exact same service, that is a high switching cost.
Mm-hmm.
And Spotify might not have the largest switching costs in the world, but it can. It can have, quite high one. And if we're looking at B2B or say a software program, the best example would be, I think, of all time, Microsoft Excel, especially for listeners in the investing, finance, accounting world. It If you were going to take Excel out of your existing workforce, especially for a larger business, and replace it with something cheaper. For example, Google pretty much gives away Google Sheets for free or an extreme discount to what Microsoft offers. And a lot of people that are starting out, including myself, younger, don't work for a large organization, I use Google Sheets. I think it's a fairly equivalent product. But if you're already been using Microsoft Excel for 10, 20, or 30 years, you have so many existing files, you have so much of your organization's data, charts, analysis, all the different departments working with Microsoft Excel under the Office 365 subscription. If you wanted to replace that from a time spent perspective, it would turn into, from employee hours, that would convert into such a large expense for your business that it's uneconomical to switch, even though Google Sheets or an equivalent is significantly cheaper if you were starting from scratch.
Yeah, yeah, it's significantly cheaper, and I think it really comes down to like how sticky the ecosystem is for those products. Like you were describing Spotify. I was thinking, I back in the day, I used to use Apple iTunes, and before I switched to Spotify, and I remember going through my playlists and albums and trying to find, some unforgotten album on my iTunes. Could I find it on Spotify? And how many hours I spent doing that. And now that I'm fully entrenched in the Spotify ecosystem, I'm not leaving, unless, even if even as they continue to keep raising the prices, I'm still not going to leave because I don't know anything better out there to replace it. And B, the time, the time value to me is not worth it to give it up. And I just wouldn't do it. And in the kind of the same, I guess, example in the business world, when I was working in the restaurant business, a lot of the small businesses that I work with, all the small restaurants that I worked in, they all use QuickBooks for their accounting. And there was nothing. I mean, there are other programs now, but they were all trained. All the accountants that worked at the restaurants were all trained on QuickBooks. They all knew it inside and out. They had all their files in there, all their systems, all their processes, and they were not leaving QuickBooks to go to another platform, even if it was easier or cheaper. They weren't leaving because they were so ingrained in that ecosystem, and it just made it was very obvious to me that that was a very high switching cost for something like QuickBooks.
Right. Yeah. Two follow-ups there. One, the connection to stock returns is that if you have that high switching cost, for example, QuickBooks more expensive, but people are sticking with it because it's not going to kill the profitability of the entire restaurant. It's not a huge cost in the overall chain of the restaurant's cost. I mean, you're worried about labor and food costs and managing, volume and all that stuff. That gives a software program like QuickBooks the ability to raise prices, and that can lead into earnings and cash flow growth, which over the long term is going to translate into stock price appreciation as long as you buy at a reasonable price, of course. And the second one is that, iTunes, as you mentioned, did have high switching costs back then. And the big risk to a high switching cost business is when there's an entire paradigm shift in the industry for how people consume. So Spotify, big paradigm shift, the music streaming model, that threw a wrench into everything. And that's why I think people are either excited or concerned or just paying high attention to artificial intelligence and AI when it comes to switching costs with software where you have, okay, well, today, if Google Sheets can build you know, basically a copycat of Excel, well, no one's going to switch even if it's at a cheaper price. But if they can fundamentally change I don't know if they can, I don't know if this is possible, the spreadsheet business, well, Microsoft can't. Well, that could lead to more customer attrition because you're getting a much higher ROI by using Google Sheets. Same thing with Adobe. I'm not an expert on, the editor stuff and kind of the, what it'd be video and graphics and marketing and stuff like that. If AI can fundamentally change how those processes work, that could leave an opportunity for people to step in and disrupt Adobe. Not saying they will. It's just when there is potentially a huge shift in the industry, that switching costs can erode because instead of just, you know, the incumbent has to have the ability to copy the existing service without ruining their existing business model, and showing like the difference between iTunes, which did have high switching costs, versus Excel. Like that spreadsheet business has essentially been the same for a long, long time, just with added features. That illustrates how, you know, switching costs and all moats are not impervious, and they're going to get attacked over time. And it kind of just depends what sort of business you're in, how the sector's doing, and what's evolving in that product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what what kinds of like if we think about the impact that AI could have on some of these businesses, I think about the spreadsheet part of the business. Could the agentic AI or AI agents, or however you want to phrase that, do you think some of that could be coming for those kinds of things, or is that something you don't really think about much?
I think it definitely could. I don't follow Microsoft that much. I do follow Google, but that's such a small part of the business. I really
Mhm.
care about other things. I think it could specifically look at them though. I would guess that within the spreadsheet business, within the say not just spreadsheets, but the Office suite that Google also has copied with Google Workspace, I would assume that Microsoft could copy any Google innovation and Google could copy any Microsoft innovation within that. But one that I think illustrates the big threat that this is more of a consumer one, which is Google search. With Android, the default distribution with Apple, Chrome, Gmail, Maps, all the stuff that kind of is around Google search that makes it much historically much better to use compared to the copycats that might still have good search results but are not a part of the whole Google ecosystem. The chatbots of OpenAI have shown that OpenAI and others that Google's had to respond to have shown that even though there's high switching costs, I think that's just another paradigm shift. And maybe Google has the ability to copycat whatever OpenAI does and improve on it, but that's kind of the threat they're facing. And I think, a lot of the switching cost business, I believe, and maybe this is what I focus on, is software technology, the cloud infrastructure providers. Even someone like NVIDIA has high switching costs given the software layer on top of that that developers use. AI is throwing a wrench in the mix and maybe could benefit some companies and hurt others, and there's just a lot of uncertainty at the moment. And as I like to talk about, and I think is a good framework for identifying and analyzing moats for businesses, is what is called a moat test. So you believe that, for example, Google Search or Microsoft Excel, two phenomenal businesses, you think they have wide moats. Now they're getting attacked by a new competitor. They're going for these gigantic cash cows, and we'll see if it can hold up to this battle.
Yeah, a good question to ask when you're thinking about that battle is how painful would it be for the customer, whether it's a consumer or whether it's a business, to leave that business? Like, how much would it hurt for people to leave Microsoft Office to go to another product? Or how hard would it be for people to leave Salesforce and their CRM and go to another CRM? Like, how hard is that? How painful is that?
Right. And you might not know that, like for Salesforce CRM, I kind of just throw my hands up. I don't really know. I don't know much about that industry. People say things, but it's almost like someone talking about this brand in a foreign country is fantastic, especially with Chinese companies. Alibaba is fantastic. Or JD.com is fantastic. Pinduoduo is fantastic. They're all doing well, apparently. And then they interchange market shares and keep trying to disrupt each other. And I have no idea what's happening. I think this comes back to, what is your circle of competence? What can you understand? Another example of potential AI disruption is we have, hurting switching costs is historically, and I think still today, your cloud infrastructure provider, you had high switching costs. If you used Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle, some of the others, it's very hard to switch. Netflix has had a long-standing relationship with Amazon Web Services, and I think they're probably their number one customer. Maybe not, but either way, very one of their largest customers. And if you were going to, if Netflix said, look, we'll switch from AWS to Azure, it's not going to cost that. Maybe it costs a little cheaper, but it would be an insanely risky endeavor to pull off because you're throwing your entire technological infrastructure and risking moving it to another platform. But from what I've heard or read and had some anecdotes, about is that with these new AI tools and software and services and cloud stuff that companies care about, Google Cloud is able to offer superior services at a cheaper price, and that's leading a lot of startups to move to Google Cloud that are focused on AI. But as we can see, you're not seeing existing customers switch because even if Google Cloud is superior, you have AWS and Microsoft Azure that can replicate a lot of what Google Cloud is doing, and they can make it so, you know, Netflix isn't going to say, let's risk our entire business to move to Google Cloud when we don't even know what the ROI is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, such a great example. If you like if you had to define or list out maybe some of the businesses sectors you think have strongest switching cost moats, like who would you put on your shortish list, if you will?
Here's what comes to mind: software, cloud, I guess if that's a little different, financials, consumer financials, or investment banking, and also including brokerages. I don't know if this isn't any sort of sponsor, but on my own show, we were sponsored by Interactive Brokers.
Mm.
So I just want to have a disclosure that I'm not pitching that I use the product, even though I do have an advertising relationship with them. Interactive Brokers is what I think the superior service for individual investors. I bought the stock. I think it's a great platform. I switched everything that I use from one of the legacy brokerages to Interactive Brokers, but it took a long time. It's kind of hard. You go, how do I even do this? I got to fill out a little bit of paperwork. It's online paperwork. You got to sign some stuff, make sure the transfer is going to work correctly. I've talked with other people and they say, yeah, Interactive Brokers sounds better, but they just go, I haven't made the switch yet. So I think brokerages have, especially if you have your retirement accounts with them, all the other stuff, not just if it's just a taxable brokerage, you can just transfer out and, you know, close the account. But those can have, along with personal banking, high switching costs as well. I'm trying to think, and I'm sure there's stuff in sectors that I don't follow that closely, but those would be the three that come to mind for me, for at least the sectors that I follow. Any that pop to mind for you, Dave?
Yeah, one in particular is it's along the same lines as the financial system, but it's the core banking systems. So companies like Jack Henry, Fiserv, Fidelity National Information, Accenture, some of those companies that basically create and monitor the plumbing for banks. So when you think about the banking infrastructure, when you go online and do that, that most of the time that's not actually done by the bank, it's done by their core provider. And tracking payments, tracking loans, deposits, all those things, the infrastructure for the ATMs, a lot of that stuff is done through the core banking system. And Jack Henry is probably one of the best examples of this. They mostly service small banks and credit unions, and their retention ratio is 93, 95%, something ridiculous. And they have a subscription service now, and that's kind of how they do their thing, is they help people and they put the plumbing in, and then the banks pay a subscription, they get the training, they get all the help they need to run their services. But the pain that it is to leave that, to your point about AWS and Netflix, it's the same with a bank. I mean, if you pull all that out and put a new system in, there's a lot of risk to do that. And it's also a lot of training, a lot of time spent, a lot of money. And you got to think too, a lot of these systems that these banks are replacing, I haven't seen it, but I've heard that some of them are still running on like MS DOS and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, what's it called? COBOL?
yeah, Cobalt.
COBOL?
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
Yep.
AI might be able to help with this as it
Yeah.
can learn these languages
Right.
quicker, but
Yeah.
that is some of the stuff that was, getting learned in the 60s, 70s.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
long time ago.
Yeah. So that's one like industry sector that really kind of springs to mind for me that is really strong. I mentioned Salesforce. I don't work in the CRM industry much, but I was actually helping my wife look through companies to try to decide because they want to change their CRM provider, and just the amount of work that they're going through to try to do it, just to find a company that they can replace and do all the things that they want. It's been a month-long process, and they haven't even started the process of changing. And this is a small business with literally 3 employees and lots of customers over the years. And so it's going to be a challenge. So, though I think there's little niches in different industries that have really high switching costs across the board.
Yeah, when you were talking, I got reminded of two others. First, which is just kind of a unique example, subscription wise, and that's Amazon Prime.
Mm.
The ecosystem they built, it's pretty hard to leave. And that, as maybe we'll talk about it in one episode, when you have multiple competitive advantages, Amazon, as people can guess, has economies of scale. They also have a bit of a network effect with the marketplace, and they have the switching costs. If you get multiple of them relating together, that can turn into some of the best businesses in the world. But a category that I think maybe is not underrated, but not followed just because it's a little bit boring, payment processors. You
Oh yeah,
have Adyen, you have Square, even though it's kind of run by some, let's say, eccentric people. Who
that's
is
being kind.
Clover is owned by someone, Toast.
Yep.
Stripe, I guess, is private, and you have those. There's a couple different layers in the chain that we don't have to talk about today, but especially like a company such as Adyen because they work with some of the large multinational consumer apps and stuff like that, such as Spotify, Uber, what have you. And they're helping them process payments efficiently and at an affordable price. And if you were going to say, well, this other company's offering us a 10% discount, but we got to rip out our entire payment solution. And when someone tries to book an Uber and the payment doesn't go through, we could have some very unhappy customers.
Hmm.
So I think Adyen especially and companies like that can have extremely high switching costs if they, provide a quality service. Quite a few, I think, subpar legacy players in that space, but that's a
Yeah.
whole nother discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And I can give you an anecdotal story about that. So when I was in the restaurant business, one of the restaurants I was working at, they decided they wanted to switch payment processors. They were going to get a better rate and a quicker turnaround on their money because generally you don't get your money when a credit card is run for 1 to 3 days, depending on which card it's being run on and what day of the week and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we switched out, they pulled out the plumbing, put in new plumbing, and it took almost a week for everything to work and for them to be able to process the payments. So not only did the technology not work, so the staff had to run all the credit cards for a week manually. So we had, the old school, sliders with the carbon paper stuff. We had to do that. We had to handwrite all the numbers in there. We had to put phone numbers on all the credit card slips. And this was a high retail, not high retail, but a high priced restaurant. And so the
Yeah, people are upset, I'm
yeah,
guessing.
yeah. Well, the customers not so much. It was the staff that was really a pain in the butt
Mm.
for the customers. When you explained it to them, they were, for the most part, they were fine. But the bigger issue was that not only did the restaurant actually had to go out and borrow money because their cash flow just dried up because they couldn't, because of the rotating of the cash of the deposits coming in from the credit cards just evaporated for a week. They didn't have any working capital. And so to pay for the food, to pay for all the stuff, they had to go out and get a short-term loan to cover all this. And I think from what I heard from management, they work with the incoming payment processor to get some of that squared away, if you will, i.e. they paid for some of it, but still it was a monster pain in the butt, and it was a very, very clear indication of how much headache a switching like this could cost a business. And it wasn't, this was a standalone restaurant in a smaller town, so it wasn't a big operation. So to your point, if you're doing something like Uber is ripping out their plumbing to accept another payment processor, it's a big deal to go through all that.
I agree. Yeah, nothing to add.
Nothing to add. All right, so let's talk about pricing power. You mentioned that kind of at the beginning. Why does this offer so much opportunity for pricing power, and what's the big deal about pricing power?
Okay, let me talk through this from a specific example of a software company, a category we talked about, but a specific company within that that has, I believe, some of the highest switching costs in the entire world, and that would be Autodesk, along with some of the engineering, architecture, and construction software providers. So Autodesk is the owner. We'll talk through one of the products of Revit, which is the premier, I think, highest market share software provider for architects. So you're an architect, you're doing a lot of software design on a building, all that good stuff, following the regulations. And if you are an architect, you are not only using this, not everyone in the company, but for at least the specific employees that have a license, you're using this constantly throughout the day. You are sending files to people. It's again similar to a Microsoft Excel, but specifically, for building architecture. It is your operating platform that you use to work with all of your customers, suppliers, what have you. Not only are you using that in your day-to-day life, but you've been trained on that at university. So you have so many man hours putting into this that there is just an extremely high switching cost to say, well, our whole business runs on Revit, but we're going to try to move to someone else and retrain everyone on all this. And that gives them high switching costs. And if you look at, now we'll get to the pricing power. Let's say a license per year for an employee at an architecture firm for Revit, let's say it's, 2,500 bucks. But that employee probably has a salary, given it's an architect, around six figures if they're entry level, and then the total cost of having that employee, office space, perks, all the stuff that they also get that the company pays for besides the salary, health insurance. The total cost of the employee might be $200,000, $250,000, but a ton of the value is created by using Revit. So if Revit goes for over a 20-year period from $2,500 and doubles to $5,000, that's not going to break the budget. And it's a small but invaluable part of that business. And then you can apply that to other software companies, marketing, the CRM solutions like Salesforce, other engineering software such as AutoCAD, oh gosh, SolidWorks. In construction, there's what is it called? Procore. It's a little different because that's more of a communications platform, and you're not necessarily spending hours and hours designing stuff within that. But those can have Adobe, another example, just extremely high switching costs. And that's one that we've talked about on my podcast before, the educational switching costs. When you get certified in something at university or at a trade school, that can actually give the company that the software is specifically used on a growing switching cost because you're literally like told this is the software you're going to use in your job. And if they switch it out, that can throw a whole wrench into the entire supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah. Great example. So what for investors, if we think about those strengths of those businesses, how does that translate to us as like, okay, Autodesk sounds awesome, huge switching costs, big pricing power. So what?
I think you still have to talk about valuation. I think you need to look at, of course, if they're trading at, and Autodesk was trading at, 50 times earnings or something like that. The returns haven't looked spectacular over the last few years, but again, buying at the right price, let's exclude that. I think when looking at a company, you need to see, and this is a good example of why someone like Spotify has done so well over the last few years, is because they had embedded pricing power, but they never raised prices, at least in the United States, for almost 15 years, and then have started to now finally do that and kind of play catch up, and that's really helped them accelerate their revenue growth. You would, I think, look at the specific software providers or specific software revenue lines and say, how much have they taken in price Is there any regulatory action that could come after them? For example, Fair Isaac Corporation, otherwise known as the company that makes the FICO score, has aggressively raised prices. And even though it's only a small part of the home buying process or any sort of loan buying process, it has been hiked, I think, somewhere like 100% or even more. And the government has complained, the housing industry has complained, I'm sure the banks have complained, and they can't leave the FICO score because they have high switching costs because, for reasons that I guess maybe are clear, but again, the FICO score is such an integral part of the entire lending ecosystem that if you just decided to get rid of it, it would throw a whole, again, just have huge switching costs for your business and might totally hurt your operations. So the downside one to look after is there government regulation potentially coming after this? You're not going to see someone come after a regular software company that doesn't have a monopoly position, that isn't dominating the industry, maybe is not in the limelight, something like yeah, I think Revit is a good example. You've seen, and I know it's not necessarily a good thing, but you've seen architectural firms complain time and time again by Autodesk price increases, and that hasn't materially translated into people churning off of the product. And that can actually be a hugely positive sign that there are high switching costs here and pricing power. And I think in general, if you find a company like this, you can be a little bit more lenient. If you still think there's tons of embedded pricing power, you can be a little bit more lenient in your valuation work because that's going to help them easily catch up to any inflationary risk. Say, for software, you don't have much commodity inputs, but you will have labor inputs. And if labor and employee costs are growing at 5% a year as they did in 2022, 2023 to catch up with inflation, they're going to be able to counteract that and maintain their earnings, and they're probably going to be able to increase prices at a faster clip than their input costs, which leads to tons of operating leverage, tons of earnings and cash flow growth, and you can see durable just revenue, earnings growth. The financial statements can steadily move up and to the right, and they can kind of control their own destiny. There's a great Warren Buffett quote, as always, as there's millions of them. And he talks about investing in companies where you don't have in the executive room everyone going into a prayer circle when you're going to raise the price by 5%. That can happen with maybe, I don't know, we're talking about restaurants. You worked into that. Restaurants are probably not, well, maybe some elite restaurants have pricing power. That can be debated, but the average restaurant probably has to, again, do that prayer circle before raising prices on their customers, as opposed to Microsoft Excel or Office 365 to bundle it all together. If it goes from $20 a month to $25 a month over a 5-year period, I don't think people are going to complain.
No. Have you?
Well, excuse me. They might complain, but they might not switch.
Yeah, right. There's a difference, right? They'll complain, but they won't switch. Kind of to your point with FICO, they'll complain, but where else are they going to go?
Yeah, and that's the only thing that can stop them is really the government.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So, do you have any examples, or can you think of any examples of where pricing power went too far? And it backfired on the company?
Oh, there are examples, but none are coming to mind. Maybe broadband internet. I don't think that was. They historically were thought of as monopolies. A lot of pricing power. It's not like internet ended up costing an absurd amount per month for most people. But you've seen, I think that's maybe more of just getting attacked by innovations such as satellite providers, fixed wireless, and fiber.
Netflix.
Something that might be a different story. People might say the credit card companies and the risks of getting disrupted there, but I'd say that's a wait and see. I don't know. Any come to mind for you?
No,
It feels like, yeah, even consumer, like people worried about Netflix raising prices. It hasn't impacted them that much. Any software companies? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it means they're good business models.
Yeah, right. Right. Could be. Yeah. I'm struggling to think of any examples off the top of my head. Like,
Well, I think, and this is maybe inverting it because it's almost like the opposite. The banks, the big banks that pay 0% on deposits, that could be thought of as pricing power just because there's the switching cost there and they don't have to pay the 4% on deposits as someone like SoFi has to. But I think they might be pushing that a bit too far because we are seeing, and it hasn't shown up materially yet,
mm,
but the rate of growth of these new banks
right.
that pay customers much better deposits, that I think might be pushing it. I do worry about the big banks having to increase their interest rates over time.
Yeah.
But hey, who knows? Inertia is a thing. People don't want to deal with it.
Right.
But that's something I focus on with my personal finances,
Right.
maximizing, cashback rewards and, just where you're keeping your high yield deposit savings. But it seems like a lot of people, given the numbers of JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, they don't. So who
Right.
knows? That could
Yeah.
be a nice pricing power test, but that's one that comes to mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably not a bad example because there has been a a demonstrative rise in neobanks, fintechs, and all those things, basically taking away. Like, I know the deposit growth for the big banks has been fine, but I think in the long run, like if I think of your generation and my daughter's generation and younger generations, they will probably move away from some of those products because they don't get as much bang for their buck. It's not worth it. It's easier on the tech. By and large, at least in my experience, some of the legacy banks tech is poor at best. And so if you think about a country like Brazil, for example, there's definitely bitten them in the butt as far as like the big banks. Then that's what's made new banks so popular is they've had the opportunity to take advantage of that pricing power that those banks had and have undercut them and helped build their empire as they've grown. So yeah, that's probably not a bad example, but there's got to be. I just can't think of any.
Yeah, I was trying to think as well. There's, yeah, people. I mean, I was trying to think through the cloud providers.
Mm,
Not really.
not really.
Um, they have good profit margins, but
Yeah.
no one's switch. No one's you don't really see huge rip and replace
Mm-mm.
projects there, at least not very often. Brokerages, maybe. I think we saw that disruption slowly over time through decreasing commission fees,
Yeah.
and a lot of them adopted their business models. But I think it illustrates that when you have a switching cost mode, it gives you the ability to raise prices, perhaps much more than most people think or that most investors think at the time. And as long as it's not run by an idiot management team,
Mm-hmm.
you can see if you buy and hold for the long term, they can be some huge, huge winners. I mean, just look at the stock charts of FICO, Microsoft, Adobe, Autodesk. Look at those stock charts.
Into it.
They're pretty nice.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They're very very nice. What are some ways that investors can try to start to identify these? Are there particular metrics that stand out or KPIs, or is it more about understanding the business and what it does will get you where you want to go?
Well, speaking the financial statements and KPIs, they may give out a churn number, but make sure to identify how they define the churn number because that's not one that's regulated by the SEC. So they could say some sort of churn number. Make sure it's a legit one. That there a lot of companies have different definitions of churn. Some people software companies give out what's called a net dollar based retention rate, which is increased spending over time. So it's almost like a same store sales figure for a restaurant or a retailer, but for a software provider. That can be somewhat helpful, but again, look at how they're defining that. So if 100% is like if some customers cohorts net dollar based retention rate's 100%, that means they spent the same amount this year as they did it in the prior 12 months or same quarter versus the prior quarter. You want that obviously above 100% if you're a software provider, and having that can be helpful, but it's also a little different because there might be some sort of upselling that they're doing where you land with something and then expand with five other products. I think in general, steady revenue growth can be a good indicator. And then average revenue per user growth can also be a good indicator. You can, if typically they'll give out the number of customers, sometimes they won't, but you can just take number of customers divided by total revenue or total subscription revenue. But I think in general, it can be more anecdotal. Look at what you're consuming in your daily life. You might even be frustrated with this product, but not unwilling to switch because of the time headache. Or look at, and this is where you can kind of get an edge, where is your specialty at work? Like with your job. And what are you using that either you love and can't switch, or it would be a huge pain to switch. And that can be something that's within your circle of competence. You understand why it's valuable. And then, hey, a lot of these companies, the brand might not be the exact same as the company name or the stock, stock name, but you can go research those, and that's where you can find them. I think it's a lot more anecdotal, and that's why there's money to be made, because you can't quantify it.
Right. Yep. Agree. Any resources you would point people towards to learn more about these ideas?
I'd say Pat Dorsey's presentations, and I think he has a book, although I like the presentations more. They talk about all four of these moat categories. I think he's the one that invented it, honestly. Warren Buffett stuff, which I guess there's a lot just saying that, but you can maybe use an AI or Google search to figure out what he's talked about with switching costs and pricing power. I'm trying to think about some of the specific software investors or software investment firms, but I would just go research the software industry and the cloud industry. They're so highly followed. There's tons and tons of stuff out there on Substack, what have you, and you can learn a lot about how these business models tick.
Yeah, for sure. A couple I'll throw on the fire. Number one would be Morningstar. You go to their website, they have lots of information about moats, and that's actually where Pat Dorsey kind of cut his teeth, and I think he's the one who kind of established their Morningstar moat rating system. And I concur with you. I listened to his Google Talks this week, and it was really good. And another one I would throw out there would be the Stratechery blog by Ben Thompson. It is paid. It's $10 a month, I think. But he is
free stuff.
Yeah, he does have some free stuff, and he's a great writer, and he's probably a really good person to like stay in touch with like tech. And the last one I'll throw out there will be Michael Mauboussin. He's written several papers about moats and really good at defining them and things to look for companies that have moats and whatnot. So a really good educational resource for that as well.
Yeah. Mauboussin. What? Well, I think it's pronounced Mauboussin. It is a funky name, but I always get it wrong. Either way.
I always call him Mauboussin, and I'm probably wrong.
Yeah, apologies, Michael, if you are listening to this. But those are some good papers. They're fairly digestible, but they may be a little bit more advanced if you're just getting into it.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you'd like to throw out there about switching costs and the strength of their moats?
I don't think so. Just remember, switching costs, they can equal pricing power. I think that's the big takeaway investors should have.
Yeah, agreed. All right, Brett, great stuff as always. Where can people find out more about you and what you got going on?
All right, you can listen to the Chitchat Stocks podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We do shows every week covering stocks and just talking about financial news, trying to have a good time while doing it, and follow the Chitchat Stocks newsletter on Substack.
Perfect. I will put all those in the show notes for everyone so they can check more of what Brett's going on. It's definitely worth your time and effort. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign us off. You guys go out there and invest with a margin of safety. Emphasis on the safety. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you all next week.